What's up, Beat Wizards? It's Planewalker here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to get your songs completed in less time in Ableton Live. All right, so the first thing that you're going to want to do, if you really want to save time in the production process, is you want to make a plan. Now, this may not sound very exciting, but it's amazing how often I see artists and how often I myself have just gone into the studio with no actual plan. And so what happens is after a couple of hours, it's like I've messed around with a bunch of sounds and actually I have nothing done. Why? Because I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going. So you can't get anywhere unless you know where you're going to begin with. And if you've got a really solid plan, it will help you stay on track. So what kind of a plan are we talking about here? What are the components of a good plan in terms of finishing a track or a project? So the first thing that I would determine is, what BPM are you going to use in your project? Why? Now, most producers are going to produce at a similar BPM, but some producers are going to go all over the place. So it just depends, but you want to make that decision before you start your track. Another thing you want to determine is what key. And that can be pretty arbitrary. But you don't want to just stop there. You want to really get into this. You want to really understand what is the type of track that you're going to make. And one thing that you can do, which I think really does help move the production process along, is what other songs will your song sound like? So this can be other people's tracks, it can be your songs, but if you have a reference to start with when you begin the production process, and you can literally just import that file into your Ableton project and then use that as a way to kind of structure your track, make it the same BPM, warp it, you'll be able to then use that reference as a way to speed along your production process. So yeah, whether it's your song or whether it's someone else's song, doesn't matter. You should have a reference track of some kind if you really want to move quickly. Also, you want to determine how long will it be. Because, in different genres of music, you're going to have different lengths of tracks. If you're making a glitch hop track, it's fine to have your track ring in at 3, 4, 5 minutes long. But if it's like a psytrance track, you're probably going to want to have a little bit more of an extended time. So it's probably going to be closer to like 6 minutes, 7 minutes, something around there. Okay? So how many bars? And these all seem like kind of silly questions sometimes, but if you determine these things ahead of time before you start working and you have good reasons for why you're setting these goals, then it's going to really help you move along faster because you're going to have metrics about how done you are. If you don't set end goals like this for when you know that you're finished with your song, the problem is that you just have no way to gauge how far along you are. You don't know whether you're done or not because you didn't know what done was. You have to define what does done mean. Because really, that's up to you. There's no hard and fast rules about how long a track needs to be. It's up to you to decide. So if you don't define what done is, and if you don't define what success is inside of your production process, you will never reach it. And there's a lot of people, because they just never do this, they never finish anything. So these kinds of questions you should start off with. Every production session that's serious, you should begin with pen and with paper. And you should think, and you should listen, and you should really use your mind here, because the more time that you spend planning your track before you sit down to begin producing it, the better it's going to be. I can tell you this is absolutely true, because I have journals that have these entries in them, and they're my best tracks that actually did the best when I put them out, because I actually used my brain and put some thought into this. Technology is no substitute for thought, and you have to define what done is and start to break that down into different pieces. So that's not even where this whole part ends. So you need to figure out now, what are the steps? Okay? So this really, you can't really figure this out until you've got some of those other questions already answered. Like, for example, if you want to make a track that's got vocals in it, and you're thinking of a specific vocalist, then the first thing that you want to probably do before you start making the track is reach out to that vocalist and see if they're available. If not, it might totally mess up your whole track idea, because if you're looking for a very specific female vocal sound and you know who you want to work with, but they can't work with you, well, there goes your idea. You could shelve it for later. But you see what I'm talking about? If you don't know what kind of song you're making, you don't know what the steps are. So typically, what your steps are going to be is, the first is going to be obviously planning, right? And then you're going to go into composition. And then the next step is going to be arranging. And then you've got mixing. And then you've got mastering. And that's just in the production process itself, because obviously when you're done with all of that, then you've got to do, things like graphic design. Someone else might be doing that for you. And then you've got to do your marketing, because it's never going to get out to the world unless you get these two things done as well. So it's not just the music. But for now, let's just look here at this. And when you're planning, you don't have to confine that just to a pen and paper. I would start there, but then once you've got a good plan and you've really written up what you want out of your track, and you've spent at least 5 or 10 minutes really thinking about this and writing this down, you're then going to want to go ahead and go into Ableton and make your tracks and name them. So you can use your imagination here, and what I like to do is I actually like to imagine in my mind what I'm going to have as different components of the song before I actually start writing any melodies or making any beats. And this can sometimes work really well with a listening session where you listen to other tracks in your genre or whatever it is to get some ideas, but it's like, there's a word for it that I like to use, which is called audialize. It's like visualizing, but except you're imagining the music in your mind before you actually start to compose it. So you can then write down what this is like, and when you've got a really, really clear idea that snaps into your mind, well, then you can begin to translate it and start with the composition part of it. So arranging is more what happens when you've got all your parts, but now it's time to actually start to build the song. In Ableton Live, I would say that all of this stuff up from here is all best done in the session view. And you can do a little bit of arranging here, but you can't finish the arranging process until you get into the standard oh, I forget what it's called, the other view in Ableton Live. It's not the arrange view. I think it's the, yeah, it's the arrange. So, sorry. Anyway, so yeah, from here on, you're going to kind of need to do the arrange view. But the whole advantage of working with a platform like Ableton Live is that you can move way faster in the arranging and mixing process if you start everything out in the session view. That's the whole advantage of using Ableton Live. If you're not using the session view in Ableton Live, you're really not maximizing the potential of this platform. You might as well use something else like Logic or Cubase or whatever, because Ableton Live really has massive power here. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how that works. But, and we're not going to get too deep into these things right here, because those are definitely more advanced topics. But it's really important to have kind of a clear idea of the steps that you want to take. Because if you try to, for example, do your mixing before you've got your arrangement or your composition done, you're going out of sequence. You're going to have to go back and readjust. And you know, if you try to mix before you have all of your elements in place and you've done the arrangement, well, you're just going to be wasting hours and hours and hours, because your first dialing in of your stuff is going to be off. And to move quickly, you just need to focus and stay in sequence. Go one step at a time in sequence, and that's where having a plan is really going to help you and understand how to do this in a time-efficient manner. So that's planning, and that's how you want to look at that part of it. So hey, if you found that helpful, please subscribe to the channel. That way you don't miss any more of these. Because seriously, you're going to get some real value out of the videos that I'm going to be coming out with next. I just want to make sure that you're paying attention and you're getting these. All right, so another thing that you can do to help yourself save quite a bit of time in the production process is to start with a template inside of Ableton Live that's set up with the instruments that you are going to use in your project. So most people, when they start out, they're just starting with a completely blank slate. They might have a MIDI track, an audio track, and there's literally nothing anywhere in this template. So you're literally having to build everything from nothing, and that can actually take a lot of time. Most people, you know, they do this because they just literally don't know how to set Ableton up to load a template. So the way that this is accessed is you can go to your preferences, and it's here in this file folder submenu where you can save current set as default. And that allows you to save the current set that you're using right now as the default set. So it will load it anytime that you open Ableton Live, which is great, because it can save you all kinds of work in just setting up your instruments, setting everything up for your track. And so the best way to do that, the best way to get your template, is to actually open up a song that you recently completed, like maybe your most recent song that you just finished, and then reverse engineer that to make your template. So we'll just wait a second here while this song is loading up so you can see what I mean. But if you're like me, you wind up with a ridiculous number of tracks in your songs, and you're probably going to want to look at this and just be like, all right, well, what do I use in every track? And just ask yourself that question. So, you know, like here, you can kind of see on the right side of the screen that I've got some scenes that are labeled as intro, drop, build, break, build, outro. So this is a lot of how I plan out my entire situation before I actually begin doing the arrangement. I actually build out all my song parts in the session view. So you might as well start out with a basic template. I mean, it doesn't have to be super complicated with a ton of tracks, but in this case I've got a ridiculous number of tracks here, and I want to see if I can trim that down to something a little bit more basic. So obviously I'm going to have drums in every track, and I'm going to have bass in every track, and I'm probably going to have a melodic component and some effects as well. And so yeah, even though each track is going to be different in the end, if I really look at what I've got, I also probably have some like atmospheric sort of sound design stuff, especially in the intro and in the bridge and in the outro. So you might start with some stuff like this, and then you might start with some tracks. That way you can be guided along. And so a good template might be something that looks maybe a little bit more like this, and still keep it fairly simple. Maybe start with like 8 tracks or something. But you could have your drums, your bass, your melody, your effects tracks, and then maybe I would add another one that's going to be, maybe for your intro, you do atmosphere. And what you can do with these tracks is you can load up whatever instruments that you find that you're using most often for these particular tracks, and then go so far as to get those presets loaded so that you can get started right away with the composition side of things. So hopefully that was a little bit helpful. You can see that we've got the intro, the drop, the build, the break, the climax, the outro. Usually I'm going to end up with more than just these 8 scenes. But if you're working with a really basic version of Live, like Ableton Live Intro, I highly recommend that you just go ahead and put these scenes in there, and you use these scenes to build your song parts before you start the arrangement, because it makes it really simple. You know, if you're not sure what to do next and you're just stuck somewhere, you can be like, okay, well, let's just build another scene. Let's work on making a song part for the break, for example. So that's another way that you can really save time. Put your tracks in there based on what you heard when you were imagining, when you were making your plan, and then make your song parts in here too, so that they can serve as like a scaffolding or a framework for you as you're working, and you don't have to just literally come up with, you know, ideas from nowhere as to what you're going to do. You know that you're going to get at least these elements in there. You know that your song's going to have at least these parts. So you can start off with that, and that'll help you stay on track as you are producing. All right, so another way that you can save a lot of time when you're producing is to set limits. It's another thing that may not sound fun at the beginning, but actually it can make for way more creativity. Because the big problem today with production is that we've got access to so many tools and so much processing power and so many loops and samples that it's very, very easy to just get lost in the possibilities, because they're like nearly infinite at this point. So now, not everybody likes to work with limitations, but I have found that the people who do work with limitations that are self-imposed, and it's clear that it's very important that you choose what these limitations are. They're not like artificially imposed limitations. They're limits that you're setting on yourself. So it's similar to just like having integrity. When you make a promise, for example, to somebody, you always keep your word. Well, if you make some commitments, and this is going to kind of go back to the planning phase of your track, you can also set some limits. So for one thing that I like to do, which I'm not very good at, but when I have done it, it's really helped me, is so you can limit yourself to X number of tracks. I did a whole album at one point where I limited myself to just, in this case, my album was just 4 tracks. And I used the same instruments for every track. So I think I did this in Logic, and I had Ultra Beat was what I used for my drums. I wouldn't let myself use anything else for my drums. And then I believe I used the ES1 synth for my bass. And then I believe that I used the Fab Filter, what was it? Twin? Yeah, for my melodies. And then I also think I used the same thing for my harmonies. So this allowed me to actually make this entire album from start to finish in just like a couple of weeks. Literally, I was able to nail a song like every day because I didn't have to think about, well, what tools am I going to use? I limited myself to just 4 tracks, and actually some of my most creative work came out of that album, which is called Spirit Circuits. And it's like a full-length album. I believe that it's maybe like 60 minutes long. I said all the tracks are going to be 111 BPM. I'm only going to work inside Logic. And let's see. And yeah, I think I promised myself that I would not allow myself to spend more than 2 days on a track. And a lot of the tracks I did just like 1 day. And this also helped. Another thing that helped with this in setting limits is I actually had a completion deadline. Because I had a live show scheduled for when I was going to unveil this new album. And I had it all set up so that I could perform the album live and do like live improvisation during like inside this set. And I could record all the variations and things like that, and then have copies of the album available for people to buy at the show. So this type of setting limits is really, really, really helpful because here's the thing. These tools that we have access to are like ridiculously powerful, you know, and if you're just like constantly trying out all these different tools all the time and not, you know, focusing on just limiting yourself to getting deep with particular tools, what happens is, you know, you just end up like wasting like all of this time messing around with all your toys instead of really getting deep and becoming masterful at them. So after I went through this, I mean, I totally had mastered these particular instruments, and the kinds of sounds and creativity that I was able to get out of these very simple instruments was actually mind-blowing. And when I listened to that album, it's actually one of my favorite albums of myself to listen to because there's so much cool variation, but yet there's a consistency between all of the tracks. It's a very defined type of style, and that can be just like, yeah, I just can't tell you how helpful it can be to work with these certain particular limitations. Now, that said, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be totally strict about those limitations. It's more like during the bulk of the process you do it that way because it's going to help streamline what you're doing. You're going to be focused 100% on composition, arranging, and then when it comes down to mixing, like you're mixing a lot of the same elements. So you can use very similar settings between the songs because you're working with similar sounds, a similar type of frequency spectrum, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just try this out, you know, see if you can set a very specific set of limitations on your next project so that you can move along more quickly and just make the most of your creativity. Because it's really, when you think about it, the time that you're working on your album where you're actually creating stuff, you're creating the melodies, you're creating the parts, and you're maybe just like tweaking and adjusting things a little bit now and then, but not spending too much time like looking for new sounds, flipping through presets, you know, messing around with different possibilities. Like that's where really a lot of the time is wasted inside the production process. Once you know what's really working for your style, there's no reason to go reinvent the wheel and start from totally scratch, especially if you know what you want in your project and you have a plan and you've made a template and all this stuff. Like you want to just get straight to the actual making of the music because so much time can be wasted messing around with the infinite possibilities that you have available to you. So another way that you can save quite a bit of time in the production process is inside of Ableton Live, you want to use instrument racks. and you want to use also audio effect racks. So these are cool because what you can do with these is you can build up a whole chain of instruments. And so, for example, like let's say that we find that we're getting a really nice sound when we use operator and we layer it with wavetable. So we can actually set this up so that wavetable and operator are layered on top of each other. And if you see what I'm talking about, if you can hear it, right, you can see that operator and wavetable now are actually layered. They're both making sound at the same time. So if we go and we load up a preset inside of operator, you know, like let's say we're building like some kind of an atmosphere, so we go ambient evolving. Okay, so we add that inside of the operator side of things, and then we can go into wavetable and look at the presets there and maybe grab another one and select that. Okay, so now we've got these two layers here that we can work with. Pretty cool. I love how that sounds. Actually, so now we can actually save this as its own preset and call it whatever we want. So we can call this like a hybrid atmosphere. And you can very easily get a unique sound by just layering a few different synths on top of each other, and then you can EQ these things differently too. You can sometimes pan these instruments differently, and just stacking up a couple to a few different presets will definitely get you a very unique sounding type of instrument with a little bit of extra processing. So that's instrument racks. Inside of audio effects racks, what we're going to look at is stacking up audio effects. So one of the most common combinations for audio effects would be like a compressor followed by like an EQ, right? And then you might even put a gate before the compressor, just so that you can level out the silence. And most tracks that you make, you're probably going to be cutting out a lot of the low end unless it's actually a bass track. So you might just go ahead and set this up from the beginning to cut off everything below 200 hertz or so, like that. And you know, it's kind of hard to do presets with a compressor, unfortunately, because the volume of tracks and the program material is going to vary very widely. Same probably goes with the gate, so you can't do much there, but you can at least save a little bit of time with that EQ plugin. And then you're going to go ahead and just like save that. You can save that rack as another preset, and you can just say this is going to be your gate comp EQ. And so now anytime you need this, you can just click and drag that in there. And that right there can be huge in saving time, because you're not just, you know, you're just with the amount of tracks that you have and in working quickly, especially once you get your workflow down, you want to be using your own preset instrument racks as well as effects racks in all of your tracks that are kind of dialed in the way that you like them. And, you know, obviously you can build this up, but it's like when you find a combination that you like this in your songs that you're working on, well, throw them into an instrument rack or an effect rack and then save it as a preset. That way, next time you do a song, you can very easily access those instruments and presets by just clicking and dragging them from the browser into your tracks. So another way that you can save a ton of time when you're working on your songs is actually something very, very simple, and it might even sound a little stupid, but it is absolutely critical that you avoid analysis. Now, you're not going to avoid analysis the entire time. Obviously, when it comes down to doing things like mixing and mastering, you're going to want to really start looking at more of the big picture. But my advice is that you avoid thinking about what you're doing, and you also avoid listening. And this is at the beginning, especially. Because when you're just starting to put together ideas, the key is that you want to be productive. You want to be creating new things. So what's really easy to do is to get a little thing I like to call loopitis, where you're just listening over and over again to what you've already made. And, that's not going to get you anywhere. That's a huge waste of time. In fact, most people who produce music probably waste more time listening over and over again to what they made than they do actually making anything. So you definitely want to avoid that. And the reason you want to avoid analysis is because when you're analyzing something that you just came up with, it's like, okay, well, what is the point of that? Like, you don't want to really start thinking critically about what you're doing until later on after you've made like a complete song. It's kind of like editing while you're writing. So I don't know how many of you guys are like really into writing, but when you're writing, it really helps just kind of turn off your brain and just write as fast as you can. And don't try to edit while you're writing. Don't go back over and read every paragraph after you've written it. No, write whatever length of stuff you need to write. If you're writing a book, then just write the book. Don't read the book while you're writing the book. Just write it. Just think of it as like a brain dump, right? And the brain dump, is going to be very disorganized if you don't have a plan. And so it's hard to do this if you haven't, followed the first thing that I said and made a plan and thought about what kind of track that you want. But if you have a plan in place and you're working from a template, it's really easy to just bang out idea after idea after idea, get on the keyboard, get on your drum pads, get on your instrument, and just start putting stuff together. And don't worry too much about it sounding perfect or sounding good together. You can worry about that later when you're doing the arranging, the mixing, the editing, and all that other stuff. But the key here is don't analyze what you're doing, don't listen to it, and don't try to edit it while you're actually creating it. In the early phases when you're doing just composition and maybe doing a little bit of combining like different things together to see if they sound good together, just don't get hyper analytical of yourself. One thing I like to say is that done is better than perfect. And imperfect action always trumps perfect inaction. So, if you catch yourself listening over and over again to what you've already made, if you catch yourself analyzing and thinking too much about what you're doing, you're not going to get anywhere. Just do it. Just make the song parts, follow your plan, move one step along, and don't get too much in your analytical mind, because it will shut down your creative mind. It has been proven that if you're thinking about what you're doing, when you have to do something that requires just action and muscle memory, that you are going to fail at it. So this applies to athletics, this applies to playing an instrument, this applies to like all kinds of things where you're literally just moving your body and you're doing stuff. So if you feel like you're stuck and you don't know where to go, stop thinking, push the record button and start playing something. And just make a song part. You know, maybe it'll suck at the beginning when you first start it, but who cares? You're better off just doing something than you are doing nothing or just listening or thinking, because that's not production. That's not making music. You know, thinking about what you're doing is not producing music. Analyzing your music is not making music either. So just work on it, and then when you get down to the mixing process, that's the point of where you want to start thinking like a little bit more. You know, maybe even towards the end of the arrangement, you're going to actually start to listen. But I actually have a rule where I do not allow myself to listen all the way through my song into like more than once in a day. Like, unless I'm actually mixing the song or mastering it. During the early phases of composition, I'm never going to allow myself to just sit there and listen all the way through what I've made, because where does that get me? It doesn't help at all. I'm just looking there being hypercritical of myself, and it is just, it feels like work, but it's not work. It's not actually productive getting you through the track. You know, when you're feeling stuck and you don't know where to go next, well, look at your plan. Do you have a bass part made? Do you have a melody part made? You know, let's say you got the intro done and you have the first break, or the first build. Now move on to the second build. You know, when that's done, move on to the break or whatever until you've got all your song parts done. Once all your song parts are done, well, now you can record them into the arrange view and start to work on your arrangement. And that's when you're going to be doing a little bit more listening, but like still, you want to focus on like one part of your song at a time, and you know, be clear about what needs to happen next. Ideally, with your plan, you're gonna work with that as you go through and work through your tracks. So you've got your notebook, you got your pen out, and as you listen, you need to be writing down what comes to your mind of what you need to do next, and then be crossing stuff off your list as you go so that you can keep yourself moving forward and not get stuck in analysis paralysis or loopitis or any of this other stuff that isn't actually taking action in your track. So hopefully this was helpful for you today. If you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit the subscribe button, and that way you don't miss anything. And if you are on Facebook, which most people are, then definitely go check out the Beat Wizardry Facebook group, because that's where you have the chance to actually interact with me in person and ask questions and get feedback from other group members. And it's a really great little community that we've started to build on Facebook in this group. So make sure that you come and request to join it, and that way we can get you some help and advice and move you a little bit further and faster along in your journey as a music producer. So we'll catch you on the next one.